April 17, 1945. Ortona, Italy. Unterfeldwebel Klaus Hartmann pressed his eye against the periscope of his Panzer IV, scanning the rubble-choked streets ahead. The medieval town had become a maze of shattered stone buildings, collapsed walls, and debris-filled alleyways. His tank commander, Oberleutnant Werner Schmidt, had warned the crew that morning about fighting in urban terrain. The British and Canadian forces had transformed every building into a fortress, every shadow into a potential ambush site. What Hartmann couldn't know was that somewhere in the ruins ahead, a British infantryman was watching his tank through a gap in a collapsed wall, his hands wrapped around a weapon that looked more like an industrial accident than military hardware. The soldier, Private Thomas Beckett of the 2nd Royal Fusiliers, hefted the 32-pound tube of his Projector infantry anti-tank, universally known by its unfortunate acronym PIAT. The weapon had a reputation among British troops as being as dangerous to fire as it was effective against armour. But Beckett had learned something during 3 weeks of urban combat that German tank crews were only beginning to understand. In the confined chaos of city fighting, where visibility dropped to mere meters and tanks crawled through streets barely wider than their hulls, the PIAT had become the most feared weapon in the British arsenal. The story of how a crude spigot mortar became the nightmare of German armoured forces begins not with battlefield heroics but with British desperation and engineering pragmatism. In 1941, Britain faced an existential crisis. German panzers had demonstrated their dominance across Europe, and British infantry possessed no effective man-portable anti-tank weapon. The Boy's anti-tank rifle, standard issue since before the war, could barely scratch the armour of newer German tanks. American bazookas wouldn't arrive in significant numbers for months, and Britain needed a solution immediately. The requirement seemed impossible. Design a weapon that infantry could carry and operate without support, that could penetrate the frontal armour of German tanks, that could be manufactured quickly with minimal strategic materials, that didn't require complex training or maintenance, and crucially, that could be fired from enclosed spaces without killing the operator. This last requirement was critical because British military planners understood that future battles would be fought in the cities and towns of occupied Europe where tanks would be most vulnerable, but also where conventional rocket launchers would be unusable. Major Millis Jeffress, already famous for his innovative weapons designs with the Ministry of Defence's research facility known as the Wheezers and Dodgers, approached the problem from an unconventional angle. Rather than developing a rocket-propelled weapon like the Germans' Panzerschreck or the Americans' bazooka, Jeffress designed a spigot mortar system that used a powerful spring to launch a shaped charge bomb. The principle was ingenious in its simplicity. A hollow tube contained a massive coil spring under tremendous tension. When released, this spring drove a steel rod called a spigot through the tail boom of the bomb, which sat in a trough on top of the weapon. The bomb's own propellant charge, ignited as it left the launcher, provided additional velocity while the shaped charge warhead concentrated explosive force into a superheated jet of metal capable of burning through armour plate. The first prototype was demonstrated in January 1942, and by August of that year, the PIAT entered production. The weapon that emerged from factories looked like nothing else in any army's arsenal. 39 inches long, weighing 32 pounds loaded, the PIAT resembled a length of industrial pipe with a shoulder stock at one end and a crude trigger mechanism midway along its length. The bomb itself, officially designated the No. 68 anti-tank grenade, weighed 2.5 pounds and carried a shaped charge warhead containing 9 ounces of explosive. The PIAT's operating principle would have seemed absurd to anyone familiar with conventional firearms. To cock the weapon, the operator had to place the butt against the ground and use their entire body weight to compress the spring through a travel of 6 inches. This required approximately 200 pounds of force and left many soldiers gasping for breath after preparation. Once cocked, inserting a bomb into the trough armed the weapon. Pulling the trigger released the spring, driving the spigot through the bomb's tail boom and propelling the projectile forward at roughly 300 feet per second. Upon leaving the launcher, the bomb's propellant charge ignited, adding velocity and stabilizing flight through 4 fins. Impact with any solid surface detonated the shaped charge, creating a jet of superheated metal moving at over 25,000 feet per second. This jet could penetrate 4 inches of armor plate at a range of 100 yards, enough to defeat the frontal armor of any German tank except the Tiger and King Tiger. But raw penetration statistics didn't capture what made the PIAT terrifying to German tank crews. The weapon's unique characteristics created tactical situations that no amount of armor or training could adequately counter. The first German tank crews to encounter the PIAT in combat experienced confusion before fear. During the Allied landings in Sicily in July 1943, elements of the Hermann Goering Panzer Division engaged British paratroopers near the Ponte Grande Bridge. Obergefreiter. Hans Müller commanded a Panzer III supporting an infantry assault when his tank was struck by what he initially thought was a mortar round. The explosion against the turret side armor didn't penetrate, but the force was tremendous, far exceeding anything a standard mortar could deliver. More disturbing was the fact that Müller had seen no rocket trail, no muzzle flash, no indication of where the attack originated. His gunner traversed the turret frantically, searching for the anti-tank gun position that should have revealed itself with smoke and dust. Instead, they faced only the rubble of collapsed buildings and the smoke of ongoing battle. 30 seconds later, a second impact struck the tank's track assembly, immobilizing the vehicle. As Müller ordered his crew to abandon the tank, he glimpsed movement in a ground floor window 70 meters away. A British paratrooper ducked back into darkness, dragging with him what looked like a section of pipe. Only later, after capture and interrogation, did Müller learn about the weapon that had killed his tank. The experience would be repeated thousands of times across Italy, France, and Germany, as panzer crews discovered that the old certainties of armoured warfare no longer applied in urban combat. The PIAT's most significant advantage over rocket launchers was also its most terrifying characteristic for German tank crews, its near-complete lack of a visible firing signature. The American bazooka and German Panzer both produced dramatic backblast and smoke trails that marked their firing positions immediately. A skilled tank crew could spot a bazooka's launch, traverse their turret, and suppress the position within seconds. The PIAT produced only a dull thump and minimal smoke, originating from the bomb's small propellant charge rather than from the launcher itself. In the chaos of urban combat, with explosions, small arms fire, and the roar of engines creating constant noise, this sound was nearly impossible to localize. German tank commanders reported that PIAT attacks seemed to come from nowhere, striking without warning from positions that remained invisible even after impact. This psychological effect proved as damaging as the physical threat. Tank crews advancing through urban terrain knew that every window, every pile of rubble, every basement entrance could conceal a PIAT team. Unlike anti-tank guns that required open fields of fire, or bazookas that revealed themselves with every shot, the PIAT could strike from complete concealment and then vanish into the urban landscape. German after-action reports from Italy and northwest Europe repeatedly mention the stress of this invisible threat, describing tank crews who refused to advance through urban areas without massive infantry support. Private James Harper of the Canadian Seaforth Highlanders experienced the PIAT's capabilities firsthand during the brutal house-to-house fighting in Ortona in December 1943. His company had been assigned to block German counterattacks through the medieval town's narrow streets, and Harper found himself positioned on the second floor of a destroyed building overlooking a street barely wide enough for a tank to pass. When a Panzer IV appeared, grinding through rubble at walking pace, Harper had a clear line of sight to the tank's vulnerable side armour from an elevated position. He shouldered his PIAT, aimed at the turret ring where armour was thinnest, and fired. The weapon's brutal recoil drove into his shoulder with enough force to leave bruises that lasted weeks, but the bomb flew true. The shaped charge warhead detonated against the tank's side armour, penetrating through the plate and filling the crew compartment with superheated gas and molten metal. The Panzer lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from every hatch. Harper immediately dropped below window level, dragging his PIAT with him. German infantry accompanying the tank sprayed his building with machine gun fire, but they were shooting at shadows. Harper had already moved to a different room, recocking his weapon for a second shot. This scenario played out thousands of times during the Italian campaign, turning German tank advances through urban terrain into grinding battles of attrition. The PIAT's tactical flexibility stemmed from characteristics that seemed like design flaws in conventional analysis. The weapon's slow muzzle velocity meant its projectile followed a high arcing trajectory, dropping 18 inches at 100 yards. This made long-range shots nearly impossible and frustrated British troops who compared it unfavourably to the flat-shooting American bazooka. But in urban combat, this high trajectory became an advantage. PIAT teams could fire over low walls, through upper-story windows, and from trenches without exposing themselves to direct fire. The bomb would arc over obstacles that would block a bazooka's line-of-sight shot, landing on the thin top armour of German tanks, where shaped charges proved most effective. During the Normandy campaign, British and Canadian forces defending the city of Caen discovered they could position PIAT teams in rubble-filled upper floors and rain bombs down onto German armour attempting to advance through the streets below. Panzer commanders found themselves in a nightmare scenario where threats came from above, below, and all sides simultaneously. The thick frontal armour that protected against anti-tank guns meant nothing when shaped charges struck from overhead, penetrating the thinner deck armour that covered the engine compartment and crew spaces. Manufacturing simplicity meant the PIAT could be produced in massive quantities with minimal resources. British factories produced approximately 115,000 PIATs between 1943 and 1945, an average of nearly 4,000 per month. The weapon required no rare materials, no precision machining beyond basic tolerances, and could be assembled by relatively unskilled workers. This production capacity ensured that British and Canadian infantry units could equip every platoon with at least one PIAT, creating a depth of anti-tank capability that German forces couldn't match. For comparison, the German Panzer, introduced in 1943 as a copy of the American bazooka, required copper for electrical firing mechanisms, specialized rocket motors, and precision manufacturing of launch tubes. German production never exceeded 2,000 units per month, and chronic shortages meant most infantry units possessed only 1 or 2 Panzer per company. British platoons often had 3 or 4 PIATs immediately available, creating multiple firing positions that could engage armoured targets from different angles simultaneously. This numerical superiority transformed urban combat dynamics. German tank crews couldn't simply suppress one anti-tank position and advance. They faced coordinated fire from multiple PIATs positioned in mutually supporting locations, each capable of killing a tank with a single well-placed shot. The shaped charge warhead technology employed by the PIAT represented the cutting edge of anti-armor science in 1943. When the bomb struck a target, a piezoelectric fuse detonated the main explosive charge. This explosion collapsed a precisely shaped copper liner into a jet of molten metal and gas moving at hypersonic velocities. The physics involved was complex, but the practical result was simple: a stream of superheated material that punched through steel armor like a blowtorch through butter. The penetration mechanism didn't rely on kinetic energy like conventional armor-piercing rounds. Instead, the shaped charge created a localized point of extreme heat and pressure that literally melted and displaced the armor plate. This meant that the PIAT's relatively slow-moving projectile could defeat armor that would stop high-velocity anti-tank gun rounds. The bomb's effectiveness didn't diminish with range, because penetration depended on the shaped charge's geometry rather than impact velocity. A PIAT bomb fired at 100 yards had virtually identical penetration capability to one fired at 20 yards, assuming it hit the target. This consistent lethality across the weapon's effective range meant that German tank crews faced equal danger whether they were being engaged at point-blank range in street fighting or from intermediate distances across open ground. German tank crews' fear of the PIAT wasn't limited to its technical capabilities. The weapon's crudeness created a psychological dynamic that sophisticated anti-tank guns never achieved. When a tank was knocked out by an 88mm anti-tank gun, crews understood they had been defeated by a formidable weapon system operated by trained artillery specialists. Losing a 50-ton Panther tank to a weapon that looked like it had been assembled in a plumbing shop fired by a single infantryman who might be a shopkeeper or factory worker in civilian life carried a different psychological weight. German soldiers, indoctrinated with beliefs about technological and military superiority, found it deeply disturbing to be defeated by what appeared to be crude weapons in the hands of barely trained soldiers. This psychological factor appears repeatedly in German prisoner interrogation reports and post-war memoirs. Panzer crews described the PIAT with a mixture of respect and contempt, acknowledging its effectiveness while dismissing its crude construction. This cognitive dissonance, the inability to reconcile the weapon's primitive appearance with its lethality, created stress that compounded the physical dangers of urban combat. The Battle of Arnhem in September 1944 provided perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of the PIAT's capabilities under desperate circumstances. British airborne forces, dropped behind German lines to capture bridges across the Rhine, found themselves cut off and surrounded by German armoured units, including elements of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions. Major Robert Caen of the 2nd Battalion, South Staffordshire Regiment, personally destroyed or disabled 6 German tanks and self-propelled guns using a PIAT over the course of 4 days of continuous fighting. Caen's experience illustrated both the weapon's potential and its limitations. During one engagement, he fired a PIAT at a Tiger tank from a range of 20 yards. The bombs struck the Tiger's frontal armour and detonated, but the shaped charge failed to penetrate the massive armour plate. The explosion, however, showered Caen with debris and temporarily blinded him with brick dust and smoke. Undeterred, he repositioned and fired again, this time aiming at the Tiger's track assembly. The second shot immobilized the tank, allowing British forces to bypass it. In another incident, Caen engaged a self-propelled gun from an upper-story window, firing down onto the vehicle's thin top armour. The shaped charge penetrated, destroying the vehicle and killing its crew. For his actions at Arnhem, Caen received the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for valour. His citation specifically mentioned his use of the PIAT, noting that he had continued fighting despite being wounded and partially deafened by the weapon's brutal recoil. Technical limitations that seemed crippling in open warfare became irrelevant in urban combat. The PIAT's maximum effective range of approximately 100 yards was considered grossly inadequate compared to the bazooka's 300-yard range or anti-tank guns that could engage targets at 1,000 yards or more. But in city fighting, engagement ranges rarely exceeded 50 yards. The maze of buildings, rubble and destroyed vehicles that characterized urban battlefields meant that tanks and infantry fought at distances where the PIAT's limited range didn't matter. The weapon's slow rate of fire, requiring roughly a minute to recock and reload between shots, would have been disastrous in open terrain, where tanks could rapidly maneuver. In urban environments, tanks advanced at walking pace, often stopped completely to navigate obstacles or avoid rubble. This gave PIAT teams time to fire, reposition, and fire again from different locations. The recocking procedure, which required the operator to stand the weapon on its butt and use body weight to compress the spring, was vulnerable to interruption by enemy fire. But in urban combat, PIAT teams operated from covered positions inside buildings or behind rubble walls, where they could reload in relative safety while tank-accompanying infantry struggled to locate them. The German military's response to the PIAT threat evolved throughout 1944 and early 1945, but never achieved a satisfactory solution. Tactical directives issued to panzer units emphasized the need for heavy infantry support when operating in urban terrain, with specific instructions to clear buildings methodically before tanks advanced. This slowed armoured operations to a crawl and negated the mobility advantages that made tanks effective in the first place. Some units experimented with mounting additional armour plates on tank sides and turrets, but the extra weight degraded mechanical reliability and still provided limited protection against shaped charges that could penetrate from above or below. The most effective German countermeasure proved to be the simplest, avoiding urban combat entirely whenever possible. But by late 1944, with Allied forces pushing into Germany itself, this option no longer existed. German forces found themselves defending their own cities and towns, fighting in precisely the terrain where the PIAT proved most effective. The weapon that British troops had initially dismissed as crude and unreliable became the tool that cracked open German defensive positions from Caen to Bremen. Real combat experience revealed patterns in PIAT effectiveness that training had never predicted. British and Canadian after-action reports noted that the weapon performed best when fired from elevated positions against the top armour of German tanks. The shaped charge could punch through the relatively thin deck plates that protected engine compartments and crew spaces, often resulting in catastrophic kills as fires spread through the vehicle. Conversely, Frontal shots against heavy tanks like the Tiger or Panther frequently failed to penetrate, though the explosive force of the shaped charge detonating against armour could still damage periscopes, injure crew members through spalling, and demoralise tank crews even without achieving a kill. Side and rear shots against medium tanks like the Panzer IV proved reliably effective, with penetration rates exceeding 70% according to British analysis of battlefield results. These findings led to tactical refinements where PIAT teams were specifically positioned to achieve flank or top attack shots, rather than attempting to engage tanks from the front. The brutal physical demands of operating the PIAT created a selection effect where only the strongest and most determined soldiers could effectively employ the weapon in sustained combat. The 32-pound loaded weight exceeded the carrying capacity of smaller soldiers, and the 200-pound cocking force meant that some troops simply lacked the physical strength to prepare the weapon for firing. British units tended to assign PIATs to larger soldiers, often former labourers or athletes who possessed both the strength and pain tolerance needed to absorb the weapon's punishing recoil. Private Thomas Beckett, the PIAT operator encountered at this narrative's beginning, stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed nearly 200 pounds. Even with his physical advantages, he reported that firing the PIAT more than 3 times in quick succession left his shoulder so bruised that raising his arm became difficult. Smaller soldiers who attempted to fire the weapon often suffered worse, with reports of separated shoulders, cracked ribs, and severe bruising that required medical treatment. This physical barrier meant that PIAT teams were often built around a single large soldier supported by ammunition carriers and spotters, who could help position and aim the weapon but couldn't fire it themselves. German intelligence assessments of the PIAT reveal a fascinating progression from dismissal to grudging respect. Early reports from Sicily and Italy described the weapon as crude and ineffective, noting its limited range and slow rate of fire. These assessments changed dramatically after the Normandy landings. A German intelligence summary from August 1944, captured by American forces and now held in the National Archives, described the PIAT as particularly dangerous in urban combat and recommended that tank crews treat any suspicious object or position in built-up areas as a potential PIAT threat. The report noted that the weapon's lack of firing signature made it nearly impossible to locate and suppress, and recommended that tanks only advance through urban areas with heavy infantry support and after thorough reconnaissance. A later assessment from January 1945 acknowledged that the PIAT had proven far more effective than initial reports suggested, particularly in defensive operations where British and Canadian forces could prepare positions and ambush advancing German armour. The document specifically mentioned several incidents where single PIAT teams had destroyed or disabled multiple German tanks, noting that the weapon's crude appearance belied its tactical effectiveness. The comparison between the PIAT and its contemporary anti-tank weapons illuminates the unique niche it filled. The American bazooka, properly known as the M1 and later M9 rocket launcher, offered superior range, faster reloading, and easier operation. The rocket propulsion system meant projectiles maintained velocity over distance and followed relatively flat trajectories that simplified aiming. However, the bazooka's backblast made it nearly impossible to fire from enclosed spaces, and the distinctive smoke trail marked the shooter's position immediately. The German Panzer Schreck, essentially a larger version of the bazooka, shared these characteristics while offering better penetration through a larger warhead. Both rocket launchers excelled in open terrain where their range and accuracy advantages mattered. The PIAT, conversely, was nearly useless in open field engagements, but proved superior in urban combat, forest fighting, and any scenario where concealment and protection from return fire were paramount. British forces recognised this distinction and often employed both weapons in combined operations, using bazookas for open terrain and PIATs for urban warfare. Personal accounts from German tank crews provide visceral descriptions of encountering PIAT fire. Unterfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, a Panzer IV commander who survived the fighting in Normandy, described a PIAT ambush during his unit's retreat from Caen. His tank was advancing through a destroyed village when a bomb struck the turret side, penetrating the armour and filling the crew compartment with smoke and flame. Wagner, positioned in the commander's cupola, survived only because the shaped charge jet passed below his position. His gunner and loader died instantly. Wagner managed to evacuate the burning tank along with his driver, but he reported that the attack came without warning. No muzzle flash, no smoke trail, nothing to indicate where the shot originated. German infantry supporting the advance fired randomly into buildings on both sides of the street, but the PIAT team had already withdrawn. Wagner's experience was repeated countless times as German armour attempted to operate in urban environments that negated every advantage their superior tank designs provided. The PIAT's success created a production and distribution challenge for British logistics. Each bomb cost approximately £1 to manufacture, a trivial sum compared to the cost of the tanks they could destroy. British factories produced over 7 million No. 68 anti-tank grenades during the war, creating a logistics pipeline that could keep PIAT-equipped units supplied even during intensive combat operations. This contrasted sharply with German anti-tank rocket production, which never achieved sufficient volume to equip all units that needed them. British supply doctrine called for each PIAT-equipped section to carry 6 bombs in addition to the one loaded in the weapon, giving teams 7 shots before requiring resupply. In practice, soldiers often carried additional bombs when expecting heavy combat, with some reports of troops carrying 10 or more rounds. This ammunition availability meant that PIAT teams could engage multiple targets during a single engagement, something that would have been impossible with weapons that had more limited ammunition supplies. Training programs for PIAT operators evolved significantly as combat experience accumulated. Initial training focused primarily on mechanical operation and basic marksmanship, but this proved insufficient for real combat conditions. By 1944, British training emphasized tactics specific to urban warfare, including proper positioning for top attack shots, techniques for engaging multiple targets from a single position, and methods for rapid displacement after firing. Soldiers learned to identify weak points in German tank armour and were taught that side and rear shots offered better chances of penetration than frontal attacks. Training also emphasized the psychological aspects of anti-tank combat, preparing soldiers for the terrifying experience of allowing a multi-ton armoured vehicle to approach within 50 yards before firing. Many soldiers reported that the hardest part of using a PIAT wasn't the physical demands or technical complexity, but the nerve required to hold fire until tanks closed to effective range, despite every instinct screaming to shoot sooner or retreat entirely. The final months of the war saw PIAT employment reach its peak effectiveness as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself. German cities, many reduced to rubble by strategic bombing, provided ideal terrain for the weapon's unique capabilities. British and Canadian forces advancing through the Rhineland and northern Germany encountered desperate German resistance built around the remnants of panzer divisions and ad hoc battle groups. In these urban battles, PIATs consistently proved more valuable than heavier anti-tank weapons that lack the tactical flexibility for close-quarters combat. The Battle for Bremen in April 1945 exemplified this pattern. British troops equipped with PIATs destroyed or disabled dozens of German armoured vehicles in house-to-house fighting that reduced entire neighbourhoods to rubble. German tank crews, already demoralised by fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and overwhelming Allied air superiority, found themselves trapped in an urban nightmare where every building could harbour a PIAT team and every street became a potential death trap. Post-war analysis by both British and German military authorities concluded that the PIAT had been far more effective than its technical specifications suggested it should be. A British Army operational research report from 1946 analysed PIAT effectiveness across multiple campaigns and determined that the weapon had destroyed or disabled approximately 2,500 German armoured vehicles during its operational service. This figure likely understates actual effectiveness because it doesn't include vehicles damaged but not confirmed as destroyed, or tanks abandoned by crews after PIAT strikes even when the vehicles remained technically operational. German post-war assessments acknowledged that the PIAT had been underestimated as a threat and that its tactical employment by British forces had been consistently effective. Several former Panzer commanders interviewed after the war specifically mentioned the PIAT as one of the most feared Allied weapons in urban combat, noting that its invisibility and unpredictability created psychological stress that exceeded the actual physical threat. The weapon's legacy extended beyond World War II. The PIAT remained in British service until 1951, seeing action during the Korean War, where British forces used it against North Korean and Chinese armour, with results similar to European combat. The weapon's basic principle, using a spigot mortar to launch shaped charge projectiles, influenced post-war anti-tank weapon development, though later designs replaced the crude spring mechanism with more sophisticated propulsion systems. More significantly, the PIAT demonstrated that in urban warfare, crude effectiveness could triumph over technical sophistication. This lesson informed military doctrine regarding urban operations and contributed to the development of weapons specifically optimized for city fighting rather than open field battles. Modern infantry anti-tank weapons, from the RPG-7 to the Javelin missile, owe conceptual debts to the PIAT's demonstration that man-portable weapons could effectively engage and destroy main battle tanks when employed under conditions that negated the tank's advantages. The Projector infantry anti-tank stands as one of World War II's most underappreciated weapons. Its crude appearance, brutal recoil, and limited range made it easy to dismiss as an inferior substitute for more sophisticated anti-tank weapons. But in the environment where much of World War II's decisive fighting occurred, the rubble-choked streets and destroyed buildings of urban Europe, the PIAT proved devastatingly effective. German tank crews learned to fear the dull thump of its firing signature, or rather, the lack of signature that made it nearly impossible to locate. They learned that their armour meant nothing when shaped charges struck from above or from point-blank range. They learned that urban terrain transformed hunters into prey, turning powerful panzers into trapped, vulnerable targets. The weapon that Germans feared more than bullets was the one they often never saw coming, the crude tube of steel that launched 2.5 pounds of shaped explosives with enough force to turn their armoured sanctuary into a burning coffin.